Welcome to the series titled Take Your Power Back, Mastering the Superpowers of Emotional Intelligence and Critical Thinking. This is the very first episode of a 25-part series designed to help you unlock two of your greatest human superpowers, their emotional intelligence and critical thinking. Now, in a world that's moving faster than ever, where AI is advancing, information is overflowing, and emotions often run high, this series will help you slow down, tune in, and take your power back. You learn how to understand your emotions, think with clarity, and respond with intention, both in your personal and professional life. So, wherever you are, whether you're walking, driving, or just taking a mindful pause, I welcome you. Let's begin this journey of becoming more intelligent with emotions and more conscious in thought. What if I told you that everything you thought you knew about emotions was only partially true? That anger, joy, sadness, these aren't hardwired responses stored neatly in your brain. That smile doesn't always mean happiness, and a scowl doesn't always mean anger. Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett, a world-leading neuroscientist, has spent decades studying emotions. Her research shows that emotions are predictions your brain constructs based on your past experiences, bodily signals, and culture. It's very important to note that they are processes, not fixed events. And that insight changes everything about how we think, feel, and make decisions. So today I'm really excited to break down how this science, combined with emotional intelligence and critical thinking, can actually help you to take back control over your mind and your choices. I'm Ayusha Shrestha, Emotional Mastery Mentor and Director of International Programs at Soft Skills AHA USA. I work with students, professionals, and leaders worldwide to develop emotional intelligence and soft skills that AI cannot replicate. Now, there is one critical truth that I've learned over the years, that before you can thrive in today's fast-paced world, you must first master your own emotions. And understanding Dr. Barrett's science gives you the tools to do exactly that. So I've been researching a lot about how emotional intelligence studies have been evolving. And when I came across Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett's findings, I was actually blown away. And the recent podcast and, of course, her TED Talks, which I highly encourage you to take a listen as well, there she has mentioned fascinating findings. And today I will be unpacking 10 crucial insights that she has mentioned in the podcast. And for me, like I said, I was really blown away because whatever we thought we knew about emotions, it really challenges that. So let's dive right in. So the first crucial insight that she talks about is emotions are predictions, not reactions. Now, it's really important to understand this. So most people think emotions just happen to us, right? Something triggers us and then we feel an emotion. And some people even say, well, I am like this. You know I get angry whenever you say this or when you do that. But Barrett's research shows that these emotions are actually constructed by the brain based on your previous experiences and bodily states. Now let's try to understand this through an example. Let's say you feel anxious before a presentation. Now here, your brain predicts danger based on past experiences. So maybe in the past, when you went up on stage or when you were presenting, you noticed that people were not paying much attention or they were challenging your thoughts and they were asking you really tough questions. So based on your past experiences, presentations turned out to be dangerous, quote unquote. Now, that anxiety does not dictate your outcome. So now, when you go and do that presentation, regardless of how you felt in the past, you can change that narrative. It's all about changing the narrative. And when you do that, the brain responds to this new narrative. So that is where you can reframe presentation experience now as an excitement. So you can feel excited about it, and you probably take more time to do your research or to be more prepared. So you feel that inner confidence. So when you're up there, you are actually excited to deliver it. And you can reframe the thinking by saying that you are going to be ready for all types of reactions. And that, just that act of reframing and rewiring changes your emotions about how you feel about presentations in this case. So the takeaway is recognizing emotions as predictions gives you power to reframe and respond consciously. So why is this a prediction? Because you already know that X, Y, and Z situation or X, Y, and Z person will make you feel A, B, C. Now you're already able to predict that, isn't it? So next time when you confront the X, Y, and Z, you are better prepared because you've already rewired your brain to look at X, Y, and Z in a completely different manner. So let's say someone disrespects you, and this doesn't sit well with you because it basically goes against your value system. And because of that, you always end up feeling triggered. Now, how do you reframe that? So, what you can tell yourself is this, that perhaps that person is going through something in their life or something does not sit well with them, which is all right because they have every right to think and feel whatever they want. But I have the choice to think and feel what I want, which brings harmony in my inner world. So I stop being triggered by that person, for example. And even if the person disrespects you, you just stop reacting in the same way. In fact, you find yourself feeling calm, really, which is a huge difference. There's a huge difference between how you used to feel and now how you feel. And I'm sure you must have heard this phrase that when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at will change. And so, this rewiring or reframing that you consciously did in your mind basically reconditions. And then what happens is the energy that you respond with, the other person feels that energy. So this is the mirroring effect. And now neuroscience backs this up because Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett, she mentions in one of her TED Talks that emotions are not built in. They are built. And this is so revolutionary. This is so fascinating because you realize that every moment is a moment that you are in control. So, what I like to do normally is this, that whenever I feel triggered, whenever I feel disturbed, I remind myself to come back to my core. So, there is this concept in my part of the world, which is shunyata, which means coming to a state of zero. It's neither positive nor it is negative. So when you come to shunyata or zero state, you stop feeling those intense emotions. Basically, you center yourself, you come back to your core, and from there, you can decide how you want to respond. Note, I did not use the word react. I used the word respond because responding is always when you think and then act. Now, the key point here is that you want to maintain harmony within yourself and the world outside of you. That is the goal, because that is what gives you peace. That is what keeps you grounded. That is what keeps you centered. And if you're able to do that, everything around you, now there are so many variables that's outside, and emotions help you to understand what matters to you. And it is extremely important to understand who you are. So it helps you to elevate your self awareness, but it does not tell you what to do. And that is the distinction between an emotionally intelligent individual and a non emotionally intelligent individual. So remember, emotions are predictions, not reactions. So learn to pause and predict and change that narrative so that you don't react, you respond. Now, here's the second crucial insight, and this particularly blew my mind because, contrary to popular belief, there is no anger center or happiness spot in the brain. Emotions emerge from distributed networks across the brain, integrating sensory input, past experiences, and bodily signals. So when you actually observe the brain and try and understand where the emotions are, Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett actually mentioned that there is no one particular emotional system. It's an integration of this neural network that is determined by the sensory input combined with the past experiences and the bodily signals. So, for example, your heart races, muscles tense up, and your thoughts speed up. Now, when this happens, all these signals combine to create your fear. So, it's a whole brain and a whole body process, and not just a single switch that you can just turn off or turn on. So, the key takeaway here is that your emotional experience is actually flexible, meaning you are not stuck with any feeling per se. So next time you hear someone say, well, you know that I get angry when you say this or do that, or when you find yourself saying that or thinking that, understand that this is not true. It's not that you're hardwired or you're born angry or you're born depressed or you're born happy. It isn't that at all. It's a narrative that we choose to believe in, and then the body reacts based on how you think. And so this is good news because now you realize that, my goodness, emotions are so flexible, which means if I feel depressed about a certain person or a certain situation, I feel unhappy or I feel sad or I feel annoyed or angry, I can change that. Because nobody wants to be stuck in those intense emotions. In fact, it harms you much more. So remember that there is no single area of the brain that basically lights up for emotions. It's a whole combined process with the whole brain as well as the whole body. Now, the reason why I found this fascinating and it blew my mind away was because it just confirms what I have been also learning in spirituality, where you have the power to change your thoughts. And emotional intelligence, the way it's evolving and how we are learning more and more about how emotions really work, for me, I had an epiphany in a way because I realized that emotional intelligence falls smack in between IQ, which is intelligence quotient, and on the other side, spirituality. So I realized that emotional intelligence actually forms a bridge between intelligence quotient and spirituality. Now, by spirituality, what I mean is basically finding harmony. That is what spirituality, in simple terms, is for me. Everyone can have their own definition, but for me, it is about finding that balance, finding that harmony within yourself, and also being at peace with the world around you. And for me, what was happening was I went on to the spiritual practices where I meditate for at least an hour a day. And I have my own way of doing things where I make sure I sit in my own space and try to quieten my mind. Like I said, coming to shunyata, which is a state of zero. And I always found that I was able to come out more peaceful. Like it's almost like I have all the answers within me and all the questions are also within me. And so if I just sit with myself, I would find the answers coming to me on its own. And, there was this kind of a gap I was feeling between the material world and the spiritual world. Whenever I would go to do my meditation, I would find that there is some kind of a gap. But with this finding, this is what blew my mind away because emotional intelligence and neuroscience confirms that you can actually rewire your brain. And there is something called neuroplasticity where you can actually change how you feel or think about everything. And in fact, you can be reborn as a completely new person if you really want to. Because if something isn't working for you, and that something has always been making you unhappy continuously, that is where emotions tell you that, hey, this is the part where you need to work on. So it tells you that that matters to you, but you need to really do some work. And then spirituality reminds you that the main goal is to be in harmony with yourself and the world around you. That does not mean that you're always happy, you're always peaceful, that you're always giving to others. You just accept things the way they are. And then you will slowly notice that you stop controlling everything and anything. I mean, I would love to do another episode on this topic itself, but what I'm trying to say is that this finding made me have this epiphany that emotional intelligence is in between IQ and spirituality. Because as humans, it's not just about consuming, right? Or the material possession, though that is looked at as success and happiness. But the more you want, the more there is to want. And it's this never-ending process. So what do? So it is about knowing yourself and knowing also where you want to be, which state, mental and emotional and spiritual state you want to be in. And ultimately, it is about being in peace, being in that harmonious state where nothing seems to take your power away anymore. And that is one of the reasons why I named this series Take Your Power Back. It is so layered, it is so profound. And the more you think about it, the more you realize that, science is in a way catching up to what spirituality already knows. But I'm glad that science is catching up because this just confirms that you can unlearn, learn, and relearn until you're able to find that peace. The third insight that Dr. Barrett shared was that emotions are processes. They are verbs and not things or nouns. So think of emotions as actions, not objects. So anger isn't a thing you have. It's a process of your brain and body preparing to act. So for example, anger can be expressed differently. Like we think, okay, anger means clenched fist or, a frown. And basically, the typical thing that you have in your mind, which is looking angry. But anger can be expressed in so many different ways. Someone may express anger by quietly planning. Someone may confront directly. And someone may even laugh at the absurdity. So the key takeaway is that seeing emotions as dynamic and adaptable is crucial for emotional intelligence. So again, when you hear someone say, I'm always this way, I'm always angry when this and this happens, well, no, that isn't the end all or be all. That's not the ultimate at all. Emotions are adaptable. You can change that. And so if anyone says that to you, please do not believe it anymore. And if you believe that, please know that you have the power to change that. Because again, when I come to the reason why I'm talking about anger most of the times is because anger is actually the most destructive emotion that we deal with or we have to deal with. So you must have also heard that when you feel angry, it's almost like you create this ball of fire within you, hoping to throw at the person who made you angry and harm that person. But actually, you created that ball of fire, and that fire is actually hurting you inside. So, that is why it's important to understand that if you yourself find yourself being angry or frustrated or annoyed, there are ways to change the perspective, right? You can already predict what makes you angry and change the narrative. And so please remember that emotions are processes. It's flexible, it's dynamic, and it's adaptable. They are not nouns. By that, what you mean is basically that it isn't the ultimate, that this is it. It's dynamic. The fourth insight that Dr. Barrett shares is that facial expressions are not universal. So, for those of us who have studied psychology, we have all come across these set of images where you see different emotions and you can basically point out, okay, this person is angry, this person is sad, this person is depressed, this person is happy. But what she says is that a scowl doesn't always mean anger, and a smile doesn't always mean happiness. And so, context matters more than the expression. Now, this is such a key insight because a lot of times we find ourselves judging people based on their facial expressions. And a lot of times we end up misunderstanding the person or the situation because we don't look at the context. We don't take the trouble to really find out and investigate what is the context behind that. So we always jump to conclusions. So people scowl only about 35% of the time when angry. Most of the time, anger appears as maybe pacing, silent plotting, or even sarcastic humor. So the key takeaway of this is don't assume you know what someone is feeling just by their face. It's like don't judge a book by its cover. Look for context next time. Look for the tone and look for the situation and try to look at the entire picture before you jump to any conclusion. The fifth crucial insight that Dr. Barrett mentions about her findings is this, that labeling emotions precisely helps to regulate them. So Barrett calls this emotional granularity. Now, this is the ability to differentiate subtle feelings like frustrated versus disappointed. So, for example, instead of saying, I feel bad, try to think about more precise emotions, like what are you really feeling? Okay, you feel bad, but are you anxious? Are you frustrated? Are you disappointed? So, for example, you could say something like, I feel anxious. And the more you flesh it out, you realize that I feel anxious because I'm uncertain about my performance. So the more precise you are, the more you're able to get into the nuances of your emotions. And that is probably the reason why we keep talking about journaling and there is this counseling services, because you really get to hear yourself flesh out your feelings and really think deeply about what you're feeling. And of course, then the next step is why you're feeling that precise emotion. So you won't actually believe that in Japan, there is actually a word that describes that awkward, regretful feeling after a bad haircut. And I think the word is hagetori. Please check it. And it just is amazing how there are these words for these distinct feelings. I think in the English language, you really don't have those precise words, but you could try and find and Google what name that emotion has in other languages, basically to feel that, that emotion exists. And you are actually able to name it, or you're actually able to pinpoint that this is what I'm feeling. And only then can you actually regulate your emotions and regulate yourself, correct? Because if you talk very generally about your emotions, then it gets really frustrating because you don't know where to start, really. So, why this matters is that when you start naming your emotions or labeling them, you allow your prefrontal brain, which is the reasoning mind, to take over. So you actually activate the prefrontal cortex and quieting the amygdala, which is actually responsible for flight or fight responses. So remember that flight or fight responses is something, again, which is the response that happens after the whole body and the whole brain decides whether you need to run or you need to fight. But the reasoning mind, which is your prefrontal cortex, will immediately get activated if you try and be as precise as possible with your emotions. What are you feeling? Why are you feeling that way? And now what I can do about it. Remember about the narrative, the changing of the narrative. So, in essence, it gives you the ability to reflect on your emotions, on those precise emotions, instead of reacting. So, remember that emotional intelligence does not believe in reactions at all, because emotional intelligence is all about the response. So, by labeling your emotions, emotional granularity, it increases choice and control over your responses. So, the key takeaway here is that the more nuanced your emotional vocabulary, the more control you have over your life. The sixth insight is that emotions are learned through culture and interaction. So remember, I had mentioned that emotions are not built in, they are built. So babies do have some basic face preferences, but they learn emotional meaning through culture and interaction. So, for example, a smile may signal politeness in one culture and genuine joy in another, and in some, maybe even danger. So early interactions shape emotional interpretation for life. So when you were a baby, you learned that X equals Y and A equals M. So basically, you kind of correlate, and we all, of course, had different family environments and social environment. And we kind of learned based on what our immediate surrounding was. But that does not mean that you have to be stuck with those emotions. Now it's about asking yourself as an adult, what do I want now? Earlier, I didn't have much choice because I was a baby and I had to understand the whole different language when I was a child. But now, if something is not giving you happiness or you're not at peace, you have the ability now to rewire, reframe, change the narrative, and actually even change the emotional language. So, to this, I normally say that you can create your own culture and your own interaction when it comes to emotions. So, the next important point that she also talks about is that emotions are functional signals. So, emotions are informational cues about what matters to you. So, remember, I'd mentioned that emotions tell you what matters to you, but they are not instructions. They don't tell you what to do. So, for example, if jealousy signals importance, right? So, for example, you feel jealous of a friend who bought a new car. Well, it tells you what matters to you is that you too want the same car or even bigger than that. But then you can now rewire or reframe that thought and say, hey, you know what? That's all right. I am working towards my passion. And for me, what matters most is finding harmony and peace in my life and not really running after material possession, though it's nice to have fancy stuff. I'm not saying that you should not go after the material possession, but if it starts to disturb your emotional state, then you really have to sit down and work through that so that when you actually see another friend buying a bigger car, then you don't feel jealous about it. But maybe you could actually turn that into a motivation. So you could have a bigger car. But then again, if you think a little more, they'll always be bigger, better. So if you think that, hey, I don't want to get into that loop of wanting bigger and better, which is all right to a certain extent, but if it starts harming you and taking your peace away, and where it's keeping you in a state of being irritated or annoyed at all times and feeling jealous at all times, then you really need to work and do something about it. So remember that emotions are data, not instruction. So just because you feel jealous, it's not like you go ahead and scratch the car when no one's looking, if you know what I mean. But what I'm trying to say is that it's great. Emotions are great to understand what you're feeling and what matters to you. But remember, they are not instructions. So the key takeaway about this insight is that this perspective allows you to pause, then process, and choose deliberate action. The eighth point reiterates the point that we already talked about a little earlier, that misreading facial expressions is common. So even trained observers misinterpret expressions if they rely solely on the face. So for example, a colleague's furrowed brow might reflect concentration, not anger. And so the key takeaway here is emotional awareness must include situation, body signals, and past patterns or history, not just facial expressions. Now, the ninth insight can actually change your life forever. The ninth insight is emotions can be developed throughout life. Now you already know that emotions are flexible. It's a continuum. So you are evolving, you are understanding yourself, and you are changing yourself. The environment around you is changing. You have these phases of life and you come across different types of people. And the relation that you have with yourself also changes over the years. So emotional intelligence is a skill that can be learned. And your brain constructs emotions based on input, which means it helps you to be aware of what you're feeling. Then again, remember labeling your emotions and then practicing how to change your response change from reaction to response can actually shape the emotional experiences you have within yourself and the emotional experience you have with the people around you, especially with those people who matter to you. So that is why mindfulness, journaling, and scenario mapping, which I will be talking about in a bit, strengthen prediction skills. So remember, it's about being able to predict better and then changing how you respond. The other realization that I also had is that, okay, emotions are information, not instruction, but you can actually even change that information. Let's say an information like I told you about jealousy, right? So that is an information, but you can change that information. Now, when you see a big car, you don't feel jealous at all. That is changing the information. So what is it that you tell yourself? What is the narrative that you tell yourself to actually change that information completely? So remember that emotions can be developed throughout life and you are in full control. A lot of times, what happens is that we give away our remote controls to everyone. And everyone, just for fun, sometimes even starts pushing the buttons. And you keep reacting and you keep reacting and you realize that you are no longer in control. That is a really sad state to be in because remember that our energy is limited. It's like this phone battery, right? You're in the green and then you deplete your energy and you go to red. The key point here is that you should do your best not to come to red, at least stay in the yellow and try to be in the green, but do not allow yourself to come to red. So remember, you can unlearn and relearn, unlearn and relearn, and this is going to be the process in your life. Today, if something makes you feel intensely, even happy, for example, 10 years down the line, maybe that does not make you feel really happy. It's about knowing yourself, seeing how you're evolving yourself and seeing how the world around you is evolving. And it's about this relationship management that you have within yourself and the world around you. So remember that you're never too old to improve your emotional intelligence. And in fact, you should continue to remind yourself that emotions are flexible. That's not something which is the end all or be all. I can always change how I feel, and I can even change the information and be at peace with myself and with the world around me. The 10th crucial insight is precision in understanding emotions improves your decisions or your decision-making skills. So remember, I talked about emotional granularity, which is about being able to pinpoint what exactly you are feeling. And when you combine that with the contextual awareness or your social awareness, it strengthens critical thinking. So to elucidate this with an example, let's say you feel irritated in a meeting. Now you finish the meeting, you step out, and you sit down at your desk, or you're just outside maybe, or you go grab a coffee. And then you ask yourself, okay, what am I feeling? How can I be precise with what I'm feeling? So let's say you realize that you feel frustrated, you feel annoyed, and then you try to flesh it out even more. And then you realize that you feel frustrated and annoyed because you feel you are not being taken too seriously. So maybe someone spoke over you while you were still trying to make an important point during the meeting. Let's say someone even said that, hey, you know what, that point does not make sense. Or the room just fell silent when you were talking and they just moved on, or something of that sort. But the point being that you recognize that you are not being taken too seriously. Now, some people, actually a lot of people, may end up snapping, and they may end up not liking the team that they're in, and they just start closing themselves off, and that then deteriorates really the teamwork spirit, and that just harms your professional career more and more. So you have to look at the social context, right? So the social awareness, now that is a professional setting, so you cannot snap. So you then sit down and you have already identified what made you frustrated. Now, okay, what can you do about it to strategically think about the inner world and the world outside of you? So maybe you go and you actually talk to some of the people who maybe spoke over you, and then you try and have a one-on-one conversation. Maybe you invite them over for coffee and you just have a chat. You can really try and get into constructive feedback, and you'll be actually surprised how many people can share what you can improve on. So the key takeaway is that when you have a clear understanding of your emotions, that becomes the foundation for strategic thinking. So remember, emotions tell you what matters to you, and critical thinking gives you the instructions to take the next step, which is very strategic and which is a conscious thinking. Now that we have talked about the 10 crucial insights about Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett's findings, I'm really excited to also touch upon another finding by Harvard neuroscientist Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor, which is about the 90-second emotional window. Now, for me, these research findings are so brilliant and fascinating because, to be very honest, emotional intelligence is actually a recent phenomenon. People are beginning to hear about emotional intelligence more and more. In fact, Dr. Daniel Goleman, who is known as the father of emotional intelligence, his book on emotional intelligence actually came out just in 1995. So it was fairly recent, right? And to now see researchers and scientists and neuroscientists taking this topic very seriously, I love that because I always felt like there was this disconnect and there was always so much of emphasis on IQ, whereas us as humans, we become humans because we have emotions and because we feel, we have these intuitive powers, and we have this importance that we place towards living a meaningful life. And now the fact that IQ is being taken over by AI, artificial intelligence, is really taking over IQ. What is left for us humans? And what makes us human is the emotions, is empathy, is compassion, is kindness, and that connection, right? So that is why I am really excited to even share this other finding from another neuroscientist, Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor. And her findings basically talks about how emotions rise when you feel an intense emotion. It rises, it peaks, and then it subsides all within 90 seconds. So it's almost like this wave, this intense emotion. So it's like a wave. It reaches a certain point, and within 90 seconds, it subsides naturally. So this shows that if you just pause, that is why I talk about the power of pause. But a lot of times, what ends up happening is a lot of us instantly react. And these instant reactions let your body and mind hijack your choices. So by instantly reacting, you disrupt this 90-second process where this intense emotion will fade away naturally. And when that happens, you are in a calmer state. And only when you're in a calmer state, your reasoning mind functions. Because when you're not in a calm state, it's the amygdala which is active, which is always about fight or flight. So when your reasoning mind becomes active, then you're able to make a thoughtful decision. So her research findings confirm that you should not just count to 10, but now you should actually count to 90. Now, some people might say, hey, you know what? I don't care even if it subsides, but if someone disrespects me, I'm gonna do something about it. You can completely choose what aligns with your values as long as it does not make you regret it later. That's the main point here. Breathing practices help me a lot. Remember, I mentioned about coming back to my core and reminding myself what matters to me. And for me, what matters is grace. I find great power in grace and even stoicism, where you don't allow anything and everything to disturb your state of mind. For me, it is the sacred thing. Peace is so sacred that I do everything to preserve that. So if someone is shouting at me, or if someone is doing something that goes against my value system, it's not like I allow that to happen and leave it as it is. At that moment in time, I don't react, but I reach out in a calmer state when that person has also come to a calmer state, and where I have an adult conversation. And I have to say this because it's only when we were a lot younger that our prefrontal cortex had not fully developed. So as a child, you would not be able to respond. You would most probably react. So I call this switching to an adult mode, and which I too had to go through this transition, because earlier I also reacted within those 90 seconds. And a lot of times when I calmed down, I would feel a sense of regret. And most importantly, I would feel like I failed myself. Because again, deep down inside, I always valued grace. I always looked up to this calm state of being, which I knew had a lot of power in it. But through my spiritual practices, And by really diving deep into emotional intelligence, I was able to understand that I just have to pause and I can reapproach that situation or that person with a calmer energy. And when I meet that person with a calmer energy, the other person mirrors my calm energy as well. Instead of making it the other way around, where the person was shouting at me and then I shout back, which is again mirroring that person's energy. So, what sits with my value system is what I needed to ask myself. So, this shouting match that used to happen all the time, I put an end to that just by pausing and just by switching to an adult mode. So now I really want to share with you 3 actionable practices that you can start doing from today itself. Now, these are the 3 practices that I follow in my own life, and trust me, my life has not just changed, but it has transformed and it has elevated a lot, actually. The first actionable practice, the first practice that you can start doing from today is, again, emotional labeling. I'm reminding you to label your emotions and to understand that emotions are data/information, not instructions. So most of us have been conditioned to also think that something's wrong when we feel these strong emotions. But as you already know, Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett reminds us that emotions are not flaws, they are information, and they are your brain's way of predicting based on your past experiences and what might happen next. So instead of asking, what's wrong with me, shift to, what is this emotion trying to tell me? Now, that small reframing changes everything. So, again, as an example, I feel anxious. All right, you feel anxious. Now you flesh it out because I feel I'm uncertain about what comes next. I feel annoyed because I don't feel understood. I feel disappointed because I had expectations, maybe too many, from someone. So when you name emotions precisely, you move from being inside them to observing them. So neuroscience shows that labeling engages your prefrontal cortex, as you know, the part of your brain responsible for reasoning and regulation. So in effect, you give your brain the time, your prefrontal cortex, the time to take the lead. And so remember, please pause. And I've already also mentioned about the 90 seconds. That's all you need to do. It's not like you have to wait an entire day, but sometimes it's all right if you just move out from that situation and you even take a day, you sleep over it and you calm down, and then you come back and approach that situation or that person with grace, with courage. And it takes a lot of courage. Trust me, it does. But at the end of the day, when you see that there is harmony within you and with that person and with the world around you, it's just worth it. So it's almost like switching on your inner scientist, where you observe your emotions without judging them and you learn from the signal. So the key takeaway here is that emotional labeling isn't self-analysis, but it's emotional awareness in action. Now, I'm really excited about sharing the second practice that you can do in your day-to-day life. Now, this is something that I personally do. I also do journaling, but a lot of times what happens is sometimes you just find journaling quite tedious. And so that in those moments, what you could do is you could do something called the scenario mapping. Scenario mapping is basically mentally mapping out possible outcomes of your decisions. So it's like running mini simulations in your head before committing to a choice. So here's how it works. First thing you do is you identify the situation. Second, you then imagine multiple possible actions, like option A, option B, and option C. Then you visualize the consequences of those actions, A, B, or C, for yourself and others. Because the decisions that you make not just affect you, but it affects others as well. So why is this so powerful? This is powerful because it anticipates the ripple effects of your actions. It reduces emotional biases, certain emotional biases that you probably are preconditioned to have. And then it strengthens foresight and self-regulation. Now, these are at the heart of both emotional intelligence and critical thinking. So, for example, let's imagine a client criticizes your work. So you get a call or you get an email, and the client criticizes your work, something that you really put your time and effort in. Now, what are the possible actions that you could take? Option A is to respond defensively. A lot of times, sadly, most of us end up doing this. But this could harm the relationship that you have with the client and for the company itself. Option B is where you completely ignore what the client had to say. Now, this will harm you a lot more because you will come across as unprofessional. And option C is you ask clarifying questions calmly. Now, this opens constructive dialogue. And not just that, it shows that you have great emotional regulation skills, and it shows that you are professional with your work. So I also want to remind you that when that situation happens, like in this case, a client criticizes your work, remember the 90-second pause. Allow your prefrontal brain to take over. When your prefrontal cortex takes over, you are then acting with both clarity as well as strategy. So make sure to see the map before you move, because every choice has a path. And now the third practice that I often use in my day-to-day life is something called the opposite test. Now this one's simple but incredibly powerful. So whenever you find yourself jumping to conclusions, which we often do, make it a habit to ask yourself, what if the opposite is true? Now, by this, I don't mean that you start believing the opposite of what value systems you have, but this allows your brain to stretch and to breathe and to allow different perspectives to come into your vision in a way. So let's imagine a colleague that seems a bit distant with you and maybe even a little snappy with you. Now, during this time, your instinct says, why is he or she being so rude with me today? But then, when you use the opposite test, you ask yourself, what if the opposite is true? So then you would begin to realize that maybe they're stressed about something, or maybe they're overwhelmed or preoccupied with something that happened in their personal or professional life. So it really helps you to expand your ability to think and observe. And it also ends up allowing you to have more empathy with others. So in essence, by practicing this, you begin to widen your emotional lens. And so you stop being a prisoner of assumptions and start becoming a master of context. Exactly what Dr. Barrett's research points to when she says emotions are constructed, not fixed. So remember, open-mindedness is emotional maturity in motion. So now, when you combine emotional labeling, scenario mapping, and the opposite test, something powerful happens. You begin to see your emotions not as fixed reactions, but as flexible predictions your brain constructs, just as Dr. Barrett's research shows. And that means that every feeling, from irritation to excitement, becomes information that you can work with. Remember, they are not a command you have to obey. Now, if you're someone who's already in the professional world or about to step into it, and you don't just want to understand emotional intelligence, but actually want to live it in your day-to-day work, you can have a look at my Udemy course called Emotional Intelligence for Business Leaders and Professionals. Now, this is a practical guide to using emotional intelligence to become the kind of conscious leader every organization is looking for. The kind who leads with clarity, empathy, and purpose. And for all the educators tuning in, if you would like to bring emotional intelligence, social emotional learning, soft skills, career readiness skills, and internship programs into your curriculum and into your classroom, you can partner with us at Soft Skills AHA, which is an edtech company based in the USA. Now, all our programs are licensed by the South Carolina Commission on Higher Education. I will make sure to keep the website down below. It's softskillsaha.com. And I would love to meet you personally. You can reach out to me directly. I'll also keep my email address down below. And I would love to meet you directly and take you through these programs because I just love how the programs have been designed. It is something that we need to teach our kids while they are at the school level. I'd love to help you bring emotional intelligence to your students and teams so they don't just adapt to this AI era, they rise and thrive in it. Also, if you prefer watching over listening or vice versa, I have got you covered. This episode is part of both a YouTube video series as well as a podcast series under the same title. The main title being Take Your Power Back, which is the series on emotional intelligence and critical thinking. So whether you're a visual learner or a podcast listener on the go, you can choose the format that fits your rhythm best. I really look forward to seeing you in the next video or my podcast series or even both. Take care, everyone. Remember to think deeply and feel wisely.